Now, let's talk about the different types of markets. So, whenever we bring in the different types of markets, we can primarily look at classifying them into two or three broad dimensions. One, I look at the markets for factors of production and finished goods or products, the market that is existing for finished goods, and the other one we look at it as capital markets. So when I look at the capital markets, it's primarily for raising capital, raising money, funding the business. So it could be raised either in the form of debt, so which is loans and bond issues, etc., or it could be in the form of equity capital. So through the stock markets, creating new ownerships within the firm, etc. And along with them, these two being classified as the primary market for capital, and these instruments, the debt and the equity instruments, being traded after the primary issue, they can be traded in the secondary market. So this entire kind of a market is categorized as a capital market. And there is one kind of a market which is purely for finished goods, where you find the end customers typically buying and selling those goods. End customers typically purchase them for using. Whereas when I'm talking about the factors of production, these are typically used by firms to produce this finished goods. Finished goods are the ones which the end customers are typically using. That's the reason they are even called as the goods market or product market. It's a final end product that is used by the customers. But these factors of production are not the end products that are used by the customers, rather they are used by the businesses to produce these finished goods. So probably when I am talking about labor is used by the firms to produce the finished good. Any kind of raw materials, some of them may not be consumed directly, but that raw material being used in the preparation of a finished good. So this kind of a market is called as a finished good market or a good market or a product market, and the other one we see it for the factors of production. Whereas in some cases there could be a few goods which are somewhere in between these two, which are called as the market for intermediate goods. So probably a company X could produce one material. If this is not consumed directly by the end customers, but this can go in the production of some other good which is used by the customers. Probably it's like this. We talk about the chips that are typically used in the manufacture of the television or probably the manufacture of the computers, etc. There is some company which produces the chips. Chips are not directly used by the end consumers. Rather, they are used by the manufacturers of the computer or the television to produce this finished good which is used by the customer. In that cases, we call those kind of goods as intermediate because they are helping in the production of the finished goods. So we really need to understand any particular good into which particular category is it falling. Any particular entity, does it fall under the factors of production or a finished good, or is it a capital market? So understanding the different kinds of markets is very essential from this particular dimension, right? Now let's look at the most important basic principle of economics, the demand and the supply function. So whenever we talk about demand, we are talking about the quantity that is demanded. and supply, the quantity that is supplied by the sellers. Demand is the quantity that is demanded or required by the buyers. What the demand function typically talks of is the quantity that is demanded for any particular good. It depends on the price of that particular good, right? Along with that, it can even depend upon the price of the other goods which are closely related to that particular good, and along with that probably on income of the person, right? And there could be any other factors that could influence the quantity demanded for a particular good. And what we are saying is the quantity demanded when I establish in this particular form, where I say quantity demanded is some particular function of the price of the good, the price of the other goods which are closely related, the income and any other factors. When I am trying to express a relationship like this, I am calling this as the demand function. So for any good, I can simply go ahead with the demand function. And basically, if I substitute the values of the price of all the other related goods, the income level of a particular person, and any other factors, when I am typically substituting all the values, which means when I am fixing all these values, the demand function is typically going out as quantity demanded is just a function of the price. So any equation, if I express it in this form, right, quantity demanded by substituting the values of all these things, if I am able to establish it just as a function of a price, generally in a linear form, this is the kind of a demand function which is taking only the price of the input, keeping all other factors as constant. This is what we call as a demand function, keeping all the other values as constant. So the moment any of these values are changing, the price of the other good increases or decreases, the demand function changes. Demand function as a function of price changes. Income level of the person changes, the demand function changes, which means changing any of these values, the demand expressed with respect to the price keeps changing. In some cases, the change could be positive, means if the price of the other good increases, probably the quantity demanded could go up, or vice versa. If the income levels are increasing, the quantity demanded for a particular good can either go up or go down. So for different values of other goods, income and any other factors, the quantity demanded function can typically either go up or go down. But when I typically look at the quantity demanded as a function of the price alone, so it can come out like the quantity demanded is some 10 minus 1.5p. So the quantity demanded, I'm trying to establish it as only price as the independent variable. And the same thing if I invert it. When I say invert, so I can say 1.5p equal to 10 minus q, and p comes out as 10 minus q by 1.5. So probably a 10 by 1.5 around 6.67 minus 0.667q. If I am writing it in this form, P in the form of Q, which means first compute Q by substituting some values of all the other factors except the price, establish the quantity demanded as a function of the price alone. And after you establish it as a function of the price, invert it, and this inverted form is called as the demand curve, because in the demand curve, the graph of the demand curve, we take Q on the x-axis, the price on the y-axis, and we try to plot this. So for Q equal to 0, P is 6.67. For Q equal to 1, P is 6.67 minus 0.66, so somewhere around 6. And for Q is 10, probably P is 0. So a kind of a line that comes like this, this is called as the demand curve. So demand function is expressed with respect to Q in terms of P and other factors. But by substituting the values of the other factors, we are getting the demand curve exclusively in terms of price. Inverting that demand function, which is in terms of price, and expressing price in terms of quantity, that is what we are calling as the demand curve. And the demand curve may show a slope which is negative, which indicates that as the price is decreasing, the demand is increasing, or as the price is increasing, the demand is falling. So the quantity that is demanded is typically increasing at the lower prices, and the quantity demanded is decreasing at higher prices. The same logic I can look at with respect to the supply function as well. So demand is from the buyer's perspective, the supply is from the seller's perspective. So the quantity which a supplier is willing to supply, right? Again, it is dependent again on the price. So if the price is high, he wants to supply more possibly, and the cost of producing it, the raw materials cost, the labor cost, if they are very high, probably he may not be supplying more and more. The technology, so there could be various factors which can influence whether a seller is willing to sell more units of that particular good or not. Now the same logic, substitute some values for all these, which means take each of them as constant. Some value for all this, which means the quantity supplied can come purely as a function of the price. So this is the supply function expressed exclusively in terms of the price. Then invert it. Invert it in the sense express P in terms of quantity supplied. This is what we call as the supply curve, right? So the quantity supplied, if it says minus 100 plus 0.5 P, you can very well write 0.5 P equal to QS plus 100. From here you can write P in terms of Q, 2QS plus 200. So this is the slope, and what we see is this says this slope is generally positive. Generally positive. For the supply curve, I see that this slope is positive because as the price is increasing, the supplier wants to sell more and more. So this is what we call as the law of supply, which says as the price is increasing, the supplier wants to supply or sell more and more, whereas the law of demand says as the price is increasing, the buyer wants to buy less and less. So when I try to plot a graph, the supply curve generally is more and more upward sloping, whereas the demand curve is more and more downward sloping, right? So this is the basic we need to be comfortable with, the demand function and the supply function, how I derive the supply curve from the supply function, the demand curve from the demand function, right? Now, the next thing we can look at is the movement along the demand curve and the supply curve. Along with that, the shift in the demand curve and the supply curve. So whenever I am talking about the movement, see, this is the demand curve. We have just now talked. It is the downward sloping kind of a graph. So whenever I am talking about the word movement, from here the demand quantity demanded comes here, or the quantity demanded goes here. This is what is movement along the demand curve. And generally what we see is the price change. A change in the price will cause the demand curve to either move downwards or upwards, because the quantity demanded would either decrease or increase along the same demand curve. The same logic goes with the supply curve also. Let's say this is the original supply curve. As the price is increasing or decreasing, the supply quantity supplied would either go up or go down. So price as a factor will cause a movement along the demand curve. But other factors, non-price related factors, they are the ones that cause the demand and the supply curve to shift. When I say shift, it can either shift to the right like this or shift to the left like this. Similarly, supply curve can shift to the left like this or to the right like this. So this cannot happen. This shift cannot happen because of the change in the price. It happens because of the change in the other factors apart from the price. So if there is a change in the price, only the movement in the curve is going to occur. Any change in the other factors is going to create a shift in the curve. And when I'm seeing a shift, a right shift in the demand curve, probably the quantity demanded is increasing throughout. A left shift, the quantity demanded is decreasing throughout, whatever is the price. Similarly, in terms of supply, a left shift is increasing the supply throughout. The right shift is decreasing the supply throughout. Right shift is decreasing the quantity supplied throughout. As the price is increasing, let's see here. If this is the price, yes, the quantity supplied is actually increasing throughout. Even a right shift, any right shift is going to increase the quantity demanded as well as quantity supplied. Any left shift is going to decrease the quantity demanded as well as quantity supplied throughout. Now if you see, for this price, originally this is the quantity demanded. But if there is a left shift, the quantity demanded is coming here. If there is a right shift, the quantity demanded is coming here. Similarly, if the price is somewhere here, originally the quantity supplied is here this much, whereas a left shift is causing the quantity supplied to typically go down, and the right shift is causing the quantity supplied to typically go up. So from the shift perspective, the other factors which are influencing the demand and the supply, a few of them that really play a role here. One is, in case of demand, we talk about the income being the other factor which causes a shift. So an increase in the income, probably for majority of the goods, the demand curve shifts to the right and a decrease will shift to the left. And prices of the related goods, in some cases the price of the related good, if a price increase happens, probably the demand quantity for this particular good either can go up or can go down or may not change at all. So the other factors that are influencing the shift in the demand curve primarily are the income levels and the related goods. We'll talk about them slightly later. Similarly, from a supply perspective, the price of raw materials, the increase in the price of the raw materials could result in the quantity supplied being either increased or being decreased. So this is irrespective of the price. So what we really need to understand is the price of that particular good or a service. If it changes, it causes a movement in the demand curve, and the factors which other than the price which are influencing the demand function and the supply function, a change in them will typically cause the shift in the demand curve either to the left or to the right. And whenever we are talking about the next part, which is the aggregation of the demand and the supply function. So whenever we are adding all the individual demand functions, we call that as a market demand function. Adding all the supply functions, we get as market supply function. And of course, again, when I invert it, I get the market demand curve. And when I invert the market supply function, I get the market supply curve. So a simple addition of all the functions will give me the market demand function. Similarly, market supply function, invert it, you get the market demand curve and the market supply curve. So logically speaking, right shift is like increase in demand or increase in supply. The left shift is like decrease in demand and decrease in supply. So that basic concept about the demand function and the supply function, demand curve and the supply curve, and movement along the demand function or a supply function, and the shift of the demand curve and the supply curve are some of the basic concepts which we need to be comfortable with. Right? Now let's look at one more important concept in economics, determining the market equilibrium. See, we have already talked about the market demand curve. We take the individual demand function, sum up all of them, invert it, and we get the market demand curve, which is a downward sloping one, and similarly a market supply curve, which is an upward sloping one. Now, so here we have a quantity demanded, and this is the price, and this is how the typical market demand and supply curves look like. This particular intersection point between the market demand and the supply curve is what is called as the equilibrium point, right? Where the market demand and the supply curve intersect, we call it as an equilibrium point. This particular quantity is called as equilibrium quantity, and the price at which market demand curve is equal to the market supply curve we call as equilibrium price. So basically it's a solving of two equations. One is the demand curve and the market supply curve. When I solve these two equations, I can come out with the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And in general, from the buyer's perspective, they try to buy more and more as the price is decreasing. And from a seller's perspective, they try to sell more and more as the price is increasing. So only when the quantity that the sellers are willing to sell match with the quantity which the buyers are willing to buy, that is what we are calling as the market is in equilibrium. Suppose, let's say the price is above this equilibrium price. The market price is somewhere here. Now, as per the market demand curve, the quantity demanded is only this much. Whereas, as per the supply curve for this price, the quantity supplied is this much. So, the quantity supplied is much higher than the quantity demanded. So, there is some kind of excess supply that is present. So, the supply is much more. So the sellers will find it difficult to sell off. The only way they can try to sell off that excess stock that they are having is they reduce the prices. So the market price again comes back to the equilibrium. The same logic. If the price is much lesser, the sellers are willing to sell only this much of quantity, whereas the buyers are willing to buy this much of quantity. So obviously we are seeing that the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So more people willing to buy, but only few items being remaining. So obviously those who are willing to buy, they are willing to pay more and get that. So the pay more is really resulting in the price going back to the equilibrium. So in this case, when the market price is actually less than the equilibrium price, we see that there is an excess demand, whereas the market price is greater than the equilibrium price, we see that there is an excess supply. But the market forces are typically working out in terms of bringing the demand, the price back to the equilibrium, even though there is an excess, even though the price is actually set more than the equilibrium or less than the equilibrium. So we'll clearly see that the price comes back to equilibrium just because of the market forces itself, right? So that is one important fundamental that we really need to see. Whereas just to understand this kind of equilibrium that is coming up, we call it as a partial equilibrium, because it is taking that the demand is purely based on the price only, all other things are constant. But whenever we are looking at it as a general equilibrium position, I'm not just looking at the demand purely in terms of the price of the good. Very other factors could influence the quantity of demand. So if I am trying to find the equilibrium, we are talking about the price of the related goods, the income levels. So if these factors are also taken into consideration and the demand curve and the supply curve intersection is typically found out, that kind of equilibrium is what we call as the general equilibrium. But in most of the practical real world situation, we look at evaluating the partial equilibrium only. So this is one dimension that we need to be comfortable with, finding out the equilibrium quantity as well as the equilibrium price. And this kind of equilibrium where the market forces bring the price back to the equilibrium, this kind of equilibrium we call as the stable equilibrium, because even if the price increase has happened, it has resulted in excess supply, and to get rid of that excess supply, sellers are willing to reduce the price, so price comes back to equilibrium. Even in the other case, when the price is much lesser, the demand is much higher, so the buyers are willing to pay more to grab the few products that are available. Means price is being brought back to the equilibrium and quantity is also being brought back to the equilibrium, and that kind of equilibrium is called as the stable equilibrium. So the supply curve and the demand curve, if they intersect in this way, supply curve upward sloping, the demand curve is downward sloping, we see that the equilibrium is always stable. Whereas there could be some situations whenever we are seeing so in some cases what could happen is the supply curve is not upward sloping, but it is downward sloping. So the demand curve is like this, in general a downward sloping, but the supply curve, let's say, is also downward sloping, but it is more steeped compared to the demand curve. Okay, let's say this is the supply curve. So this is what we are calling as the equilibrium. So this is the equilibrium price. Now let's assume that the price is set here Because of the price being set here, I see that the quantity demanded is actually this much, whereas the quantity that is supplied is this much. So the quantity that is supplied is more than the quantity demanded, which is resulting in an excess supply, and that excess supply should bring the price down, and it is coming back to the equilibrium price. So as long as the supply curve is above the demand curve or cutting the demand curve from above, even if both of them are downward sloping, as long as the supply curve is cutting the demand curve from above, which means it is more steeply sloped compared to the demand curve, we see that the equilibrium is coming back to be the stable position. But think of it the other way. The demand curve is downward sloping. The supply curve is also downward sloping, but it is, let's say, less steeply curved compared to the demand curve. Now what is happening? This was the original equilibrium price and this is the original equilibrium quantity. Let's say the price increased. So price increased, the quantity demanded has fallen and the quantity supplied has also fallen drastically, which means it has resulted that the demand is more than the supply. Quantity demanded is more than the quantity supplied, which has resulted in the price actually increasing. So rather than the price falling, it is resulting in a still further price increase, which means the price is not coming back to the equilibrium price. So this kind of an equilibrium we call as unstable because it's not coming back to the original equilibrium price. An increase in price or decrease in price are not bringing the price back to the original equilibrium. That's where when we see that the supply curve is less steeply sloped compared to the demand curve, we say that the equilibrium is more and more unstable. And in some cases, yes, a very interesting case is of the bubbles. Especially, let's say this is the demand curve. What we see is as the price is increasing, we may see that the demand for that particular good typically increases. So probably the demand curve could be, let's say if it is something like this, it might very well happen that the supply curve is more like this and the price increase whatever has occurred, people look at it like as the price is increasing, probably they are trying to look at the demand being increased because they assume that the current price increase is an indication of the future price increase. So just like this unstable situation, any increase in the price is going to shoot up the price even more. So the price is increasing more and more and more constantly, a very high unstable equilibrium position. But after that, as the price has increased, suddenly the prices have actually fallen back. Right? This is where we are calling as a bubble and a burst in the bubble. And when the prices have fallen, we are seeing that there is a kind of a stable equilibrium position that is typically coming up. So bubbles are one example of an unstable equilibrium. The price keeps increasing, and once it has reached the maximum, it might very well burst out and the prices are falling drastically. And when the price has fallen down, it's an indication that the equilibrium has typically been met. So this is one more important equilibrium position that we can very well observe in the market, especially this kind of bubble situation we see in very highly growing sectors or those kind of sectors which are very heavily cyclical real estate kind of sectors As the price is increasing, people expect that the prices will still further go up, creating an unstable equilibrium, and more unstable equilibrium. After a certain point in time, we see that the bubble burst happens, results in the price coming down drastically, creating a stable equilibrium position. So the supply curve more looks like a curve like this, where there is up to a certain point we see that it is downward sloping, and after that we see that there is a kind of an upward sloping built into it. So this is one more way we can evaluate the market equilibrium position. Then the other way to determine the equilibrium price is the method of auctions. What is the actual price to buy or sell? There are different forms of auctions, but the auction is one primary way to typically determine the equilibrium price. And on a broader sense, we have two major forms of auctions. One is a common value auction, and two is a private value. Common value is something for that particular good or a service, the value is common to all the bidders, right? May or may not be known, but it is uniform for all the bidders. Whereas when I look at a private value, each bidder will have a different value. He perceives, based on how he perceives that particular good or a service, he gives a different value to it. Whereas in case of common value, the value is the same, and it all depends on how much overvalued the bidder goes for. That particular bidder is the winner. So the bidder who quotes the maximum or who overvalues it with a large difference, they become the typical winner, and that's the reason we call common valued auctions more as winner's curse. Winner is really the one who had really overvalued that particular item, and he is winning that, right? So because the losses are much more for a winner compared to the other participant, though he has won the bid. Whereas from a private value auctions perspective, we are talking of for each person the value is different. So how much he really values it, how much is the value according to him, he'll try to go with the maximum value for that. So that kind of a price which he really values we call as the reservation price, and he can typically go ahead in terms of quoting his reservation price. And within these, both the common value or a private value auctions, we find different kinds of variants. One we call as English auction. In an English auction, the price is typically an ascending price. So the first participant, he quotes some X, the next bidder he has to do some X plus, the next bidder X plus plus, so it's a kind of an increasing price until no more bidder bids above it. And the person who has bidded the highest, he is going to be the winner, and whatever the amount he has bidded, let's assume here this person is the winner, he has to pay X plus plus to typically purchase that particular product. So this is the way the English auction really works. Then we have a sealed bid auction where the prices may not be revealed. Every bidder is going to submit a price. So some may submit X, some may submit X plus, some may submit X plus plus, Y, Z, whatever it is. So different bidders are going to submit different amounts. In general, they may go up to the reservation price or slightly less than the reservation price. They try to quote some amount, and whosoever is the highest, all the bids are opened at one single point, and whosoever has quoted the highest bid is going to be the winner, and he will pay that amount which he has typically bid. So In some cases, he may go much higher than his reservation price also. Just to be the winner, he'll try to quote slightly more than the reservation price also. So the reservation price may or may not be the same as the bidded price here. Whereas in this same, there is a small variant called as the second price sealed bid auction. Again, more or less the same. Different bidders are going to submit different prices, right, in a sealed covers, and whosoever has bidded the highest, he is the winner. But the only difference is he will not pay X plus plus, rather he will pay the second highest bidded price. So if this is $100, if this is 99, obviously he is the winner because he has bidded the highest, but he will pay a price which is equal to 99, which is the second highest bid value. And this kind of second price sealed bid auctions are otherwise called as Vikray auctions. Right? So the person who has submitted the highest bid is going to win, but he is going to pay the price equivalent to that of the second highest bidder. So in this case, at least he can go directly with his reservation price itself. He need not quote above the reservation price to get an undue advantage or to get a better possibility of winning the bid. Even though he wins, he has to pay the price of the second. So he can go more with his reservation price itself. There is no incentive for quoting anything more or less than the reservation price. Then we find, just like an English auction where we call it as an ascending price auction, we see Dutch auctions which are otherwise called as descending price auction. So whenever I am putting a descending price, the first quote is the highest at which something can be bought. Then it goes lesser and lesser and lesser until you find all the buyers, until we are finally looking at the least possible price at which something can be bought. So it's like from a seller's perspective, it comes, the seller is willing to sell it at this particular price, but okay, there is one buyer who is willing to buy it at this particular, some buyers willing to buy it at this particular, some buyers willing to buy it at even lesser. So if there are multiple goods, I really want to find out that minimum price at which all these items can be sold. So if there are some buyers who are willing to buy it at this price, sell that quantity. If there are some more who are willing to buy at this price, sell that quantity. If there are some more, until all the items are getting sold, the price of it is coming down and down and down. So this is kind of a Dutch auction, right, where the highest price is the starting point and the price is reduced until the buyer is willing to buy it. So more and more units there, we are trying to evaluate the number of units bought at this price, number of units bought at this price, until all the units are typically sold. And in some cases, which we call as the modified Dutch auction, the same process happens, but instead of looking at different buyers at each of the different prices, we are talking about, okay, let's say at this price the last buyer has come out, then sell the good at this price to all. Though there are some buyers who are willing to buy some number of units at this price, some at this price, offer the same price to all, which is the least possible price where you can sell it to all the buyers. So this is where we are coming up to the last, all the bidders, and whatever is the last price that is associated, you give it as the one single price to all the bidders. And this is what we are otherwise calling as the single price, right? The single price or modified Dutch auction, where there is only one price that is available to the bidder. which is the one that the last bidder has typically gone for, where all the units can quite comfortably be sold out. And also, in case of this modified Dutch auction, along with the single price, we also talk about non-competitive bidding. What is this non-competitive bid? Okay, this is the single price which the last bidder is willing to buy at. Now, along with the bidded prices, some bidders can typically place a non-competitive. Means they don't want to participate in the bidding process, but they are going to accept that particular price which the seller is willing to sell it, which comes out as the least possible price. The last of the possible prices, whichever is going to emerge out in this modified Dutch auction process, at that single price, they are willing to buy it. Means they are not participating in the determining of the price, but whatever the price that comes out, they are willing to buy those many units at that particular price. So they will specify the units they are willing to purchase at that particular price. So which means, let's say if there are 10,000 units to be sold, right? 10,000 units to be sold. Out of that, let's say for 3,000 units, there is a non-competitive bidding that has come out. And let's say there are 1,000 units which are willing to, where people are willing to buy at some X. Another 4,000 units people are willing to buy at X minus 1. Another 5,000 units people are willing to, or another 2,000 units people are willing to buy at X minus 2. Another 4,000 units people are willing to buy at X minus 3. Now there are 10,000 units to be sold. 3,000 are non-competitive. So I'll see, okay, only for the remaining 7,000 units I'll find out the price. Okay, 1,000 at this price, 4,000 at this price, so 5,000, 2,000 at this price. So 7,000 cutoff is getting over here. So the price, the single price that gets decided is X minus 2 for all of them. Though there are 1,000 which who are willing to buy at X, I will offer them at X minus 2 itself. And though there are 4,000 units that can be sold at X minus 1, I am going to sell at X minus 2 only. And even this 2,000 I am going to sell at X minus 2. And the 3,000 which are going as a part of the non-competitive bidding also, I will be selling at X minus 2 only. So the single price that comes out as a part of this process is X minus 2 but not X minus 3. I will not consider this 4,000 anymore because there are 3,000 non-competitive bids as well. So this is a typical way that a modified Dutch auction with a single price along with the non-competitive bidding built into it typically works. So we have different kinds of auction processes, and each auction process decides the equilibrium price to buy or sell a particular good in a different manner. So we need to be very comfortable with this concept of equilibrium price, different ways in terms of determining these equilibrium prices, right? Now let's look at another important concept, which is the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Okay, for that let me take a simple situation. Yes, this is the demand curve, right? And let's say this is the supply curve. I'm taking them linear, fair enough, a very normal way of understanding it. Now, if I start looking at it, this is the equilibrium price and this is the quantity. Now let's say if the price is here, if the price goes here, which means there are a few customers who are willing to buy at least this much of quantity. Even if the price goes here, there are someone who is willing to buy this much of quantity. If the price is here, again there are a few people who are willing to buy. Only a few units can be sold, but that is getting sold some quantity, which means if the price is even higher, what we typically see is some kind of quantity is getting sold, but may not be the equilibrium quantity, maybe lesser than the equilibrium, but there is some quantity that is getting sold even if the price is much higher. So this is where I talk about, if the price which the customer is willing to pay, right, the price which the customer is willing to pay above the equilibrium price, so that difference which the customer is willing to pay above the equilibrium price, we call it as the consumer surplus. So he is, for him, the value of that particular good is this much, but the actual price, he may be, he is actually paying for the equilibrium quantity is this much. That excess is what I'm calling as consumer surplus. And if I add up this entire consumer surplus, if I add up this entire consumer surplus, which is nothing but the area of this particular triangle, because for different prices we are seeing different kinds of quantities are getting purchased, means for each different volume of the quantity there is some surplus which the consumer is willing to pay above the equilibrium. Right. So this entire total consumer surplus is what we are calling as the total value to the society, because this is the value that is coming up, because the customer is willing to pay this much but he is ending up pay only this much. So this is the kind of benefit that is coming to the society by the product that is getting sold only at this price, though they are willing to pay this much. So that's the kind of value that the customer is getting by paying lesser than what he is valuing for it. So that's the reason we call the consumer surplus as the value to the society. The same logic when I go with the producer. Again, if this is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, what we are typically seeing is this should be the equilibrium price. But even if the price is lesser, there are a few suppliers who are willing to sell it at this price. So the quantity is getting reduced, it is lesser than the equilibrium quantity, but there is some quantity. Means the producer is willing to sell it at this price, but the price at which he is really selling is this much. So the benefit that the supplier is getting by selling it at a price higher than what he is willing to sell at is what we are calling as producer surplus. So that's the reason this entire area, right, the area between the supply curve, the y-axis and the equilibrium price, this is called as the producer surplus area. And this producer surplus in other case we are calling as the marginal societal cost curve. So it's a cost curve. So the producer is willing to supply this much because it's the excess of the market price above the opportunity cost of the production. Market price minus the opportunity cost of production is typically coming. So that's a kind of a benefit that the producer is getting, because he is willing to sell it at the lesser price, but he is actually selling it at a higher price. So the marginal, no, sorry, the supply curve can very well be looked at as the marginal cost curve, and the demand curve can very well be looked at as the marginal benefit or marginal marginal societal benefit curve, whereas the supply curve can be looked at as marginal societal cost curve. And when I am trying to sell a particular item at this particular price, the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus, this entire thing is getting maximized, because there are a few for whom this is the value, there are a few for whom this is the value, there are a few for whom this is the value. So this overall value is this entire rectangle, so the entire triangle. This is the overall consumer surplus, this is the overall producer surplus. Now, what we typically see is any kind of an obstacle that comes out where I may not be able to sell at this particular price, slightly higher, slightly lesser, because of various reasons. The consumer surplus and producer surplus will not be maximized, and whatever the portion that is not contributing to the maximized value, by whatever extent it is lesser, that is what we call as the dead weight loss, because of not being able to produce and produce an equilibrium quantity and sell it at an equilibrium price. There is some loss that is coming out, and that kind of a loss where we are not able to get the allocative efficiency. So when I am trying to sell the equilibrium quantity at the equilibrium price, we say that that particular system is having allocational efficiency, but anything which is departing from that allocation efficiency is resulting in a deadweight loss. So any deviation from that condition, inefficient allocation that is coming out, so the maximization of the consumer surplus and producer surplus, that will not happen, which will result either in overproduction or underproduction. So any kind of loss that is coming up because of producing more than the equilibrium quantity or lesser than the equilibrium quantity is resulting into a loss, that is what we call as the dead weight loss. Let's look at this scenario. All right, let's look at this. This is the demand curve, right? Let me just, for understanding, let me try to link it like this. This is the demand curve, and let's say this is the supply curve. So this happens to be the equilibrium price, this happens to be the equilibrium quantity. Now let's say because of some reason the price is set at this, means the price is actually set at this level. So which means the price above the I mean the equilibrium, the price, now this is the price at which someone is the item is particularly sold at. The value above the price at which it is sold, we called it as consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is only this much, right? The consumer surplus is only this part. And what about the producer surplus? This is the cost for the producer, but he is selling it at this price, but he can sell only this much quantity, right? Because he is selling it at this price, he is only up to this much he can sell at this particular price. Only this much is getting bought, so he can sell only this much, and on this the surplus which he is creating is this part. This is the producer surplus. So overall, if we had seen, had the pricing been here, this entire set is being the maximization of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. But this part now is not going into the consumer surplus or producer surplus, and this is called deadweight loss. And this has come out because of underproduction. This triangle, which is not going as a part of the consumer surplus or the producer surplus, resulting in a kind of underproduction, this is what we are calling as the deadweight loss, right? If the price is increased, the deadweight loss is coming up from that perspective. Look at the same in case of a price decrease that is coming up. right? This is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity. This is the supply curve, this is the demand curve. Okay, now let's say the price is set here. So this is the market price. So from the supplier's perspective, this part is the producer surplus, and he can sell only this much. So from the consumer's perspective also, this part is going ahead towards the demand wise. What we see is if the price is here, the demand is going to be somewhat here. But from a supply, so the whatever the consumer is willing to pay, if the price is set here, this portion all goes for consumer surplus. But you don't find the sellers willing to sell this much. The sellers are willing to sell only this much of quantity. So for selling this much of quantity, actually this is the price. So which means I could see that this part is getting contributed towards the deadweight loss because of overproduction or because of underproduction, because the demand is much higher compared to the supply. So what we are seeing is anything that is anything if the quantity that is supplied is much lesser, what we see is it's an underproduction and a deadweight loss is getting created because of the underproduction. And if the quantity supplied is much higher because of the overproduction, the deadweight loss is getting created. Only when we are seeing that there is an efficient allocation of the resources, we see that the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus overall is getting maximized. Otherwise, there is a deadweight loss that is getting created either because of overproduction or underproduction. And what we see in the real world is there are so many restrictions that create this deadweight loss. If it is freely left to the market, right? If it is freely left to the market, wherein they produce this much quantity at this much price, which is leading to the efficient allocation of the resources. But there are so many restrictions or impediments on that. We'll talk about each of them. But the most common kind of restrictions we see is something to do with the prices. In some cases, the government fixes the prices. So they can put a cap on the price, which is on the higher side, or they can put a floor on the price, which is on the lower side. So the caps are typically called as price ceilings. The floors are called as price floors. They are the ones that are going to impact. Then the taxes that are levied by the government could result again in not meeting the efficient allocation of the resources or not going for equilibrium quantity at an equilibrium price. Then we'll talk about quotas, which also have a similar kind of an impact. Sometimes subsidies that are offered by the government, even they create some kind of deadweight loss. So they really deviate the equilibrium quantity, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. They are not matched with the equilibrium quantity, resulting in either overproduction or underproduction, and that is what is resulting in the creation of the deadweight losses. And along with this, we also see that in case of public goods, again, there is some possibility of a deadweight loss getting created, and some kind of common resources, the access to the common resources, again, a deadweight loss can get created in those. And even if for those kind of goods which are having external costs or benefits, all these are possibly resulting in a deadweight loss because of underproduction or overproduction. So let's look at the prices one by one. Let's go ahead and see. Okay, the price related ceilings or flooring. Probably let's look at them. Okay, this is the supply curve, this is the demand curve, this is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity. Now, if the price, maximum price, let's say price ceiling, let's talk about. Price ceiling, if it is set somewhere below the equilibrium, right? Price ceiling is set below the equilibrium or price ceiling is set above the equilibrium. Two instances. Now, if the price ceiling, the maximum price at which you can sell is this much. Of course, you are selling lesser than this, so no issues. So, if you say the maximum price you should sell it is this much, obviously the demand is lesser, right? If the price is here, the demand is lesser, the supply is higher, it may result in an excess supply and the price can get come back to the equilibrium. So they are trying to sell it at a lesser price only. So nothing is going to impact. So the ceiling that is set above the equilibrium price, it has no impact. But if I assume that the ceiling is set somewhere here, which is below the equilibrium. Now what is that we are seeing? The consumers are willing to buy this much of quantity, whereas the suppliers are willing to sell only this much. So there is a kind of excess demand, and this excess demand is creating a shortage when the price is set at that particular quantity. And what we see is the quantity demanded is much higher than the quantity supplied. And because of this, there is a deadweight loss that is getting created because because it is resulting in an underproduction, and this underproduction is resulting in a deadweight loss of this much. So this is a deadweight loss that is getting created if the price ceiling is set at a price that is lesser, because in the long run what is going to happen is, because of this price ceiling, there is a lot of waiting time that is coming up because supply is lesser compared to the demand. So there is a possibility of a black market that can develop. Consumers are willing to pay excess in black to typically purchase that. The waiting times are much higher, and from the supplier's perspective also, they may do some kind of a discrimination in terms of selling. When I say discrimination, because the quantity that is sold is much lesser, they try to prefer their friends and relatives first and then to the normal public. So some kind of black market, some kind of bribing to buy those shortage stock, all these things can come up, and even it can result in affecting the quality of the product as well. So all these things really need to be looked at while looking at the price ceiling. Any ceiling that is set below the equilibrium price could result in a shortage, which can result in all these problems, right? Similarly, when I look at a price floor, okay, this is the quantity demanded, quantity supplied, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Now let's say the price floor, if it is set somewhere here, the minimum wages that needs to be paid is this much. Really doesn't matter because we are paying more than this, the efficiency is not getting impacted. So the price floor, it is less than the equilibrium price, there is going to be no effect at all. But when the minimum price is greater than the equilibrium, which says, okay, every employee needs to be paid a minimum of this much. So the minimum price that needs to be paid, if this is the kind of a minimum price, minimum salary that needs to be paid, the supply is much, much higher. There are so many people who are willing to work at this particular salary. But what we see is the demand would be much, much lesser, because the companies will not be in a position to pay that much salary to hire a large number of people, which is resulting in overproduction. right? Over supply, over production is resulting. So there is a kind of a surplus that is getting created. Instead of a shortage, there is a surplus that is getting created if the price floor is set above the equilibrium. Again, this is resulting in overproduction, which is also resulting in the creation of the deadweight loss. This proportion is causing a creation of a deadweight loss because of the overproduction that is coming up. Again, when this kind of situation is there, from the employer's perspective also, because they have to pay this much of salary, they try to do some kind of layoff. They'll use only a few people, pay that high salary, high wages, but go with very few resources and probably divert the capital into some other mechanisms. Probably they use automations instead of paying for the labor because the minimum wages are much higher. So they will divert that to some kind of capital resources rather than the labor resources, and they try to cut down on the labor, and which may result in increase in the unemployment levels as well. So they try to look out for other less expensive mechanisms and lay off the labor, which can result in unemployment as well. So the price ceilings and price floors, they distort the regular equilibrium layer, resulting in excess demand or excess supply, depending on whether it is a price ceiling or a price floor, and that is again bringing out some kind of a deadweight loss, right? So that's one dimension to look at. Then we can also look at the taxes. The next important thing that we can talk about in this dimension is the taxes. Now, if I see the tax, okay, it's nothing to do with the price now. So this is where we'll start looking at a shift in the demand curve and the supply curve. Okay, supply demand. Now let's say the tax can be applicable either on the consumer or it could be applicable on the supplier. So either the producer can be taxed or the consumer can be taxed. So let's say if the producer is taxed, automatically the producer will reduce the production. So the supply will reduce across, which is resulting in a new supply curve which is changed to which is shifted towards the left. The demand curve may not change. It's only the supply curve that is shifted to the left because the supplier is taxed. But if the consumer is taxed, the supply curve may not change, right? So this is the kind of a situation that can happen if the tax is applicable for the supplier. But if the tax is applicable for the consumer, the demand for that particular good will reduce because the consumers will start looking out for alternatives. So the demand curve is going to shift to the left. So the tax on consumers can result in this. The tax on supplier is going to be this much. And whatever is the difference that is coming out, it is purely the vertical distance. If I look at that, is the amount of tax. By that much amount, I see that the supply comes down or the demand comes down, right? And now if you see, okay, what is the new equilibrium here? Instead of this being the equilibrium price and quantity, now what we are seeing is this is becoming the equilibrium price and quantity. Now, if I see this much, the quantity which the consumer is willing to sell is this much because the supply got reduced, right? So for this quantity, actually the buyer is ending up paying this much. So the buyer is paying this much, the supplier is getting this much. The gap is what is resulting in the tax, right? Because it has reduced the quantity that is getting supplied, but for this the customer is willing to pay a price of this much. So overall resulting in this part being created as a deadweight loss. So this is the amount that the customer is really paying. This is the amount that the supplier is really getting, and the gap is what is going to the government. Here also you see that the supplier, okay, from the consumer's perspective, now this is the demand curve, this is the supply curve. So the new equilibrium is coming out to here, and the price that is being paid by the buyer is coming out to be this much. Earlier the price that was getting paid is this much, price, equilibrium price. Now for this price, from a supplier's standpoint, sorry, this is the supply curve, this is the demand curve. So I see that the demand curve will shift to the left, not the supply. The demand curve will shift to the left, which means this is going to be the new equilibrium price. The consumer is ending up selling at this price. Sorry, the producer is ending up selling at this price. The consumer is ending up buying at this price, again resulting in a deadweight loss coming up in this situation as well. So whatever is the vertical distance from what the buyer is paying and what the seller is actually receiving, that is what is the portion of the tax. So some portion above the equilibrium, the portion for the buyer is the incidence to the buyer, means that is the excess over the equilibrium which the buyer is typically bearing, and the difference between the equilibrium and the price, the amount which the seller is getting, is what we call as the tax incidence to the seller or producer. Right, the tax incidence to the producer or the seller, and whatever is the tax portion, the tax portion is what comes out multiplied by the quantity that is working out, is the revenue which the government is getting overall because of the incidence of this particular tax. Now, in some cases, the government may levy the tax on the supplier, which will shift the supply curve to the left. In some cases, it may tax the buyer, which will shift the demand curve to the left. But that particular thing, whom the government is charging, that is called as the statutory incidence. So those particular parties whom the government is charging, so from the legal perspective, who is responsible for paying the tax, that is what is called as a statutory incidence of the tax. But from the actual perspective, how this tax is getting allocated between the buyer and the seller. Now if I see here, okay, this is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity. Now let's say the supplier is taxed, okay, supplier is taxed like this. Now this is becoming the new equilibrium. So for this equilibrium, if this is the equilibrium for the existing demand curve, the price is actually, the new equilibrium price is going to be this much, which means the price which the buyer is willing to pay, buyer has to pay, is this much. Whereas for the same quantity, from a supplier's perspective, the amount that the supplier is receiving is this much, right, because of the tax. Now what we are saying is this portion is the incidence to the supplier, this portion is the incidence to the buyer. So this is the total tax which the government is getting. Out of this, logically the buyer is bearing this much portion of it, the supplier is bearing this much portion of it. Though it's a supply, though it's a levy of the tax on the supplier alone, the supplier is bearing some portion of the tax, the buyer is bearing the remaining portion of the tax. This is what we call as the actual incidence. Of course, it's the supplier who is logically paying the tax, legally paying the tax, but some portion of the tax he is able to collect it from the buyer. Now this all changes based on the shape of the demand curve and the supply curve. Now, if I see that the demand curve is more or less flatter, and let's say the supply curve is very steep. Now, let's look at it. This is the price, this is the quantity. Now, I see that the supply curve is shifted to the left, supplier is charged. Now, obviously, I see because of this charge, this is becoming the new equilibrium. So the new equilibrium price is this much, means the price the buyer is paying is BT instead of P, means this is the excess which the buyer is paying. But for this quantity, the supplier is actually getting only this much. So this is the portion of the tax that the supplier is bearing. So in this case, what I am seeing is the supplier is bearing a majority portion of the tax, whereas the buyer is bearing only a smaller portion. Because the supply curve is very steep, whereas the demand curve is very much flat. So, depending on the shape of the demand and the supply curve, which we call as elasticities, I come to them slightly later. But depending on the elasticity associated with the demand curve and the supply curve, we see that in some cases the supplier bears a majority portion of the tax, and in some cases the buyer is bearing a majority portion of the tax. So who is getting penalized can very well be understood from this kind of a relationship. So elasticity wise, so if I am seeing the demand curve more and more horizontal, we see that it is more and more elastic. The elasticity is very high. Whereas if the demand curve is more and more vertical, I see that it is more and more inelastic. Now let's look at this situation of taxation. Okay, this is the supply curve, and let me see that the demand curve is more and more flat, vertical. What we could see here, this is the price, this is the quantity, then there is a demand that has gone down. I mean, then we are seeing that the supply curve shifted to the left because of the tax. So this is becoming the new equilibrium. So the price which the buyer is paying is this much, whereas from the seller's perspective, he is receiving this much. So his contribution to the tax is only this much, whereas the buyer's contribution to the tax is more. So if the demand curve is more and more vertical, right? If the demand curve is more and more vertical or more and more steep, we could see that majority portion of the tax is borne by the buyer. But if the demand curve is more and more horizontal, we see that the seller is going to bear the majority portion. The actual incident, we are not talking about statutory. Statutory could be the levy from the government who has to really pay. Now let's say the same example, if I talk about again the demand curve being less elastic, so I'm making it more vertical. The supply curve, let's say, is normal. Now let's say the buyer is taxed, not the seller. So the demand curve is shifted to the left. Earlier, this is the equilibrium price. Now the new equilibrium that is coming out is this one. For this, the supplier is getting this, which is resulting in a lesser, whereas for this, the buyer is ending up paying this much. So this is the contribution of the buyer, and of course this part is the dead weight. So again, in this case, the more and more vertical the demand curve is, when the demand curve is vertical, we say that it is less elastic or inelastic, relatively inelastic. So if the demand curve is much lesser elastic, we see that the buyer is bearing a majority portion of the tax. But if it is more and more elastic compared to the supply curve, we see that the seller, so whichever one is less elastic, right, whichever the curve, demand curve or the supply curve is less elastic, means whichever is the one that is more steeper, we see that that particular party is going to bear a majority of the tax compared to the other parties. So if it is completely inelastic, probably if let's say the demand curve is completely inelastic, it will be a straight line like this. The supply curve is like this. Now this is the equilibrium price. You see that the tax is levied, let's say, on the consumer. So this is going to be the new equilibrium price, right? New equilibrium price, but for this quantity is the price from the buyer is nowhere coming out. So whatever the price that the supplier is getting is less this much, but the buyer might be paying a majority portion of it. So the complete incidence of the tax is on the buyer itself. But on the other side, if it is more and more horizontal, we see that the complete incidence of the tax is on the supplier itself. So the tax and the impact of the tax, statutory wise, depending on the government who will be paying the taxes, that's the statutory incident. But how is that burden really distributed between the buyer and the seller is what is coming out with respect to the actual incidence. And easier way to find out is it is purely based on the elasticities of the demand and supply. The more inelastic the demand curve or the supply curve with respect to the other, that particular party is going to bear the major portion of the tax. If the demand curve is more vertical or more steeper, I see that the buyer is going to bear the majority portion of the tax. If the supply curve is more steeper, the seller is going to bear majority portion of the tax, right? So that's one dimension with respect to the taxes. Then some more impediment that can really impact is the subsidy. So subsidy is a kind of a benefit the government is giving to the producers. Okay, supply curve, demand curve, because it's giving a benefit to the producer, the producers are willing to supply more and more. So obviously the supply curve shifts to the right. So this being the new equilibrium price and the quantity. So this from a supplier's perspective, he is having a cost of only this much, right? He is bearing a cost of only this much, whereas from a buyer's perspective, the overall equilibrium for this particular quantity is going to be this much. So supplier is willing to sell this much by incurring a cost of this much, means the buyer is going to pay only this much part. So the excess is resulting in a deadweight loss, right? So the supply curve with the subsidy is going to shift to the right. The overall price which the buyer is going to pay is typically decreasing, because the supply curve is more relating to the marginal cost, whereas the demand curve is more to do with the marginal benefit. And what we are seeing is marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So the deadweight loss is coming because of the overproduction. I am seeing the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit, which is resulting in an overproduction and a deadweight loss getting created because of the overproduction. Similarly, the other impediment comes out as the quota. In case of quota, it's not the price that is regulated, it's the quantity. So instead of producing this much, if the government says the quota is set at a higher value, no problem, right? Because it is talking about the maximum production. So if it says the maximum production is this much, no issues. But if it is set here, that is where the issue comes up, because the quota is at the max, only this much quantity can be produced, whereas this is the equilibrium. And because of the shortage of production, for this quantity, the price is this much, but from the buyer's perspective, he is willing to pay this much, resulting in a deadweight loss here. and because at this quantity needs to be supplied, the price from the buyer's perspective is getting set at this particular level, and the producer is producing lesser underproduction, which is resulting again in a deadweight loss. Because here we are seeing that the marginal benefit, which is the demand, is greater than the marginal cost, and now obviously whatever the demand is greater than the supply, which is the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, we can very well see a deadweight loss coming up because of the underproduction, right? So in all these cases, we see that the allocative efficiency is getting impacted because of various scenarios that are being impacted by the government. In some cases, I could also see public goods. See, in case of public goods, you could see that those kind of goods which can be used by the public, whether they pay or not. So, people use them, generally the national defense, parks, those kind of stuff. They can be used by the public whether or not they pay for them. So, they are enjoying the protection even though they are charged or not. So obviously, in that case, the suppliers will be willing to reduce the supply of those kind of goods. So the less than efficient quantity will be supplied, because because everyone is getting a benefit without really paying for it. A free rider kind of a problem. So so we see that underproduction, and it can result in a deadweight loss. So generally we see common resources like water, rivers, etc. Everyone can use, they need not pay for it. So what we typically see is there is a little incentive to improvise them, because everyone is using them without any kind of a paying for it. So the improvisation may not result at all. And most of the times we see that the resources are overutilized. So more overproduction than what is really required, because people keep using them because they don't need to pay for them, right? So that's some kind. Similarly, we look at external benefits and external costs. In some cases, what we see is consuming that, right? The benefit that is experienced by the buyer without really paying for it. See, let's say some company or some company has typically developed a road for its own benefit purpose or for its own employees purpose, but this road is typically used by the common public as well. So there is a kind of a benefit that is coming to the external parties, but that cannot be taken into consideration while developing this. So the supplier is not going to take the benefits that are coming to the general public while utilizing. That's the reason we call them as the external benefit. So the societal benefit of the good or service that is not really taken into consideration. So the benefit, so what we typically see is less than the efficient quantity itself, because what the excess benefit that is coming to the society is typically not taken. So marginal benefit, the excess benefit that is going to come up, that is not really considered, which is resulting in an equilibrium quantity that is produced and consumed, which is lesser than the efficient quantity itself. Similarly, there could be a situation of external costs, the costs that are imposed on others by the production of goods which are not taken into the production decision, especially let's say pollution. Any kind of a pollution that is going to occur, that is not just going to affect the demand and supply of the good, it is going to impact the health of the people who are outside the system. It's an additional cost that needs to be borne, and it has nothing to do with the demand. So the cost is going to be much higher with respect to the society than the typical cost of production. So over allocation of resources has to happen because there has to be some care. So overall resulting in an over allocation of the resources. In this case, where there are external costs, underproduction is going to happen. In this case, where the external benefits are there, even in case of public goods and common resources, the similar kind of situations are going to occur. So all these things are typically expected to have an increasing impact, and they are going to distort the typical equilibrium price and quantity, and they are trying to bring out the deadweight loss in the entire positions. So allocative efficiency is getting violated in all these situations, right? So this is where we really need to understand the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the total surplus, which is the summation of the consumer and the producer, and what do we mean by the maximization of the societal consumer surplus and producer surplus, and where we really see that the market or the government interference is really creating a reduction in the consumer and the producer surplus, thus leading to a deadweight loss, right? Now, let's look at the different elasticities of demand. Whenever we are using the word elasticity, I'm talking about the responsiveness or the sensitivity, right? The responsiveness or sensitivity of one item with respect to the other. When this item is changing, by what extent this particular item is responding is what we call as the elasticity. So here we would be talking about three major elasticities of demand. One is the price elasticity of demand. One, we look at it as the income elasticity of demand. Then we'll talk about related price elasticity of demand, or sometimes we call it as cross price elasticity of demand. So we'll or this price we also call as the own price elasticity of demand. So we'll try to understand these concepts. So whenever we are talking about the own price or the price elasticity of demand, to start with, I'm looking at what is the sensitivity of the quantity demanded to a change in the price. So typically the formula comes out as the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. If this change is very high, means if the price changes by a very small amount, if the quantity demanded changes drastically, then this ratio is very high. The higher the value is, we call that it is elastic, more elastic. Otherwise, we use the word inelastic, right? If the price just say changes by 1%, so if the price increases by 1%, because of the downward sloping curve of the demand curve, we see that if the price is increased, the quantity has to decrease. But if I say that the quantity is decreased by 3%, then we say that the demand elasticity, the price elasticity of demand is -3, because there is a drop by 3% for an increase of 1%, resulting in price elasticity of demand being -3. Whereas if a 1% increase in price results in 0.3% drop, we say that the demand price elasticity of demand is -0.3. So if the value is much lesser than 1, ignoring the negative sign, because always we see that price elasticity of demand to a large extent it will be negative only. In some cases it will be positive. We'll look at them slightly later, but a general scenario is the price elasticity is going to be negative. So if I ignore the negative sign and I see that the value is less than 1, I say that it is more and more inelastic. And if I ignore the sign and I see that the elasticity is greater than 1, I say that the demand is more and more elastic. And of course, if this is going to be going to be very very high, a price increases by 1%, quantity demanded falls by 100% almost. This is where we say that it is perfectly elastic. And when I see perfectly elastic, the demand curve will come out to be more and more horizontal, because a small change in the price will shift the quantity demanded from here to here. Right? A small change in the price, small increase in the price, probably the demand is completely shifted off. So that is what we call as perfectly elastic demand curve, and we see that the shape is more horizontal. And when I see perfectly inelastic, so this is called perfectly elastic demand curve, this is called perfectly inelastic, because even if the price changes by any extent, the quantity is always fixed. The quantity is not changing. The price has no impact on the quantity demanded. So that's where we call it as perfectly inelastic. So the elasticity will be more and more closer to infinite in this case, and the elasticity is very close to zero in case of perfectly inelastic, right? And generally, when there are no substitutes for the good, no proper substitutes, even if the price is increased, I can't do anything. I have to buy this quantity. So if that particular good cannot be substituted with anything, I see that it will be more and more inelastic. Let's say water. Even if the price of the water is going up, I can't replace water with anything else, let's say, then I have no other go except apart from paying that high price and consuming that quantity which I typically require. So those kind of goods are said to be perfectly inelastic, and in some cases, if there are very perfect substitutes, if one of them is gone up in the price and the other did not change, I could very well switch to that other by completely reducing the consumption of this high price good. So the more and more I see substitutable goods, the more and more elastic the demand for that particular good is, the more I am not able to see any kind of substitutes, the more inelastic is that particular one. Right? So when I am looking at the elasticity computation, it is more in terms of percentage change. The percentage change in quantity demanded corresponding to the change in price. So this is, let's say, if it is a regular demand curve, right? If it is a regular demand curve, okay, let's see here the price change from here to here, some percentage change. Quantity wise, this is the quantity. So this percentage terms wise, this is much higher, because if I'm saying, okay, the price is 10, the price is 8. So the drop in the price is 20%. So let me say that the quantity demanded is 3 and or 4, and let's say the quantity demanded is 5. There is a 25% increase in the quantity demanded. So resulting in a very high value. The same parallel, probably if I am drawing it here, saying 6 and 6 here, the percentage drop 8 to 6, or probably 10 to 6 if I see that the percentage drop is 40, but here it is 50. So the increase in the percentage is going to be much higher at a higher point, but it is going to be much lesser here. So what we see is, if the demand curve is more and more linear, above a certain point, we see that the elastic nature is very high, more than 1, so more elastic. And here we at some point we see that the elasticity is unitary, and below it we see it is inelastic to a large extent. So at different points, the elasticity is going to change for the same demand curve, because we are not looking at in terms of absolute quantities, we are looking at it more in terms of percentage. So change by the same amount from here to here, 8 to 9 increase, which is 1 unit increase, but it is only 12.5% increase. Whereas here, 1 unit increase is resulting in a 25% increase. So the quantity with respect to the price, we see that it is much higher. So the elasticity, or it is relatively inelastic here, whereas it is more and more elastic at a higher point. That's one point that we need to be understanding. And on the other side, we should also look at the total revenue dimension. Right, the total revenue is coming out as the quantity multiplied by the price, and what we see is where it is unit elastic, I can very well see that the quantity multiplied by the price at unit elastic point, the quantity multiplied by the price, which is the total revenue, is going to be maximized. Anything more elastic or anything less elastic, those kind of positions are resulting in a compromise on the total revenue. So wherever it is unit elastic, we are seeing that the total revenue is also maximized. So this is one more way the elasticity can really help us in terms of maximizing the revenues. Then the other a few things, right, which are impacting the demand elasticity. If I'm talking about substitutes, very good available substitute, obviously it is going to result in elasticity being much higher. Right, people are ready to, if there is a price increase, they are readily willing to shift to something else. Apart from that, the percentage of the income that is spent on that particular good, if that percentage is very high, which means if I am spending 80% of my total income on that particular good, right, if that is going to increase, probably my demand is going to fall very drastically. So it is going to have a higher elasticity. But if that particular good is just 2% of my total income, and if the price has increased, I may not shift away from using it. I am ready to pay that additional slight increase in the price, and I am still going to grab it. So my demand may not change drastically. So if the proportion of my income on that particular good is high, the elasticity is going to be much higher. But if that particular good constitutes a very less proportion of my total income, then I may not worry too much on it. So my elasticity may not be much higher. Similarly, another important factor that plays a role in terms of the elasticity is the time since the price change. So if the price has changed very recently, probably I will not shift too much. But if the price has changed longer time back, people might have adjusted towards some alternatives. So the quantity demanded would have changed drastically. If the price change occurred yesterday, if the price increase has occurred yesterday, today I may not react to it. I will assume that it may come back. So I may not react that heavily to it. So the elasticity may not be that heavy. But if the price has increased long back, it did not adjust, so it's time for me to really look at alternatives. So I'm going to shift towards other possible alternatives, and because of that, the quantity demanded could really fall down. So the longer the time period since the increase in the price has occurred, the higher is the elasticity of demand associated with it. So that's one more factor that could influence the price elasticity of demand. Now, the other dimension that I am bringing in is the income related elasticity. So, which we can define as percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by percentage change in income. If the income levels have gone up and the quantity demanded for a good is going up in some cases and it may go down in some cases. So whatever is the sensitivity or whatever is the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in income is what we are calling as the income elasticity, and even this is not in absolute term. I am finding it in terms of percentage itself. So in some cases it can be, in majority of the cases it will be positive. Higher is my income, higher is the quantity of good I may be demanding for it, and those kind of goods are typically called as normal goods. If I start demanding more and more units with the increase in the income, I call those goods as normal goods. If the quantity demanded goes down for an increased income, we call them as inferior, because now that my standard of living has gone up, I will stop consuming the local product. So the demand for the local product will go down. The demand for the low quality product will go down because my financial position has improved. So I'll start enjoying a better quality product. So for the low quality products, what we see is as the income levels are going up, the quantity demanded are going to go down. Those are categorized as inferior, and for those kind of goods where we see that the income elasticity of demand is positive, we call them as normal goods, right? Then one more important elasticity of demand that we need to look at is the cross price elasticity of demand. Again, percentage change in the quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price of a related good, not the same product. This is what we call as cross price elasticity of demand. So if the price of one good has increased and the quantity for the other good is also increased, we see that the cross price elasticity of demand is positive. So let's say, let me talk about two things, tea and coffee. If the price of tea has gone up, the demand for coffee has gone up, because people start consuming less of tea and they start consuming, let's say, more of coffee, because the price of tea has gone up. So we say that the cross price elasticity of demand is positive, and in this case we say that they are more and more of substitutes to each other. The higher is the cross price elasticity of demand, we say that the products are substitutes. But similarly, you look at fuel and cars. If the price of fuel has gone up drastically, the demand for cars is going down, because cars are depending on fuel, and because the fuel price has gone up, the demand for cars also has gone down apart from the fuel demand going down, which means the cross price elasticity of demand is negative in this case. And in this case we can say that these two products are complementing each other, and that's the reason the increase in the price of one is resulting in a decrease in the demand for the other. So the more and more the cross price elasticity of demand is more and more positive, we say that they are better substitutes, and if it is going more and more negative, we say that they are better complements to each other. So we can always go with the percentage change in quantity demanded divided it by the percentage change in price or income or the related good price, and try to arrive at the computation of the elasticity of demand for that particular good or service, right? And then we can categorize it as more elastic, inelastic, normal or inferior good, substitute or complement by computing the appropriate elasticity of demand. right?